Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring how organisations that have to work in fragile environments can manage risk. My guest, Colin Pereira, is director at HP Risk Management, a consultancy that assists companies and media organisations operating in challenging environments. In simple terms, that involves supporting journalists and broadcasters in managing risks when they go into war zones, disaster locations, or engage in dangerous investigations. In our discussion, Colin explains how he went from studying Islamic fundamentalism to working for the BBC, firstly as part of the security team, and then as a journalist, where he worked in some very dangerous locations. That means that he's got some fascinating anecdotes about the kinds of risks that journalists face and what the organisations that employ them can do to mitigate the risks associated with it. Of course, the business of journalism is to report, so news organisations need to get their reporters into locations that the rest of us might prefer to avoid. As a human risk challenge, this is multifaceted, because many of the risks facing journalists in the field are human, and the decisions the journalists make in response to those risks while on assignment also provide plenty of opportunity for human risk to manifest itself. And then there are the broadcasters and publishers that employ them. They need to think about how they can manage the inherent risks in their business, a fascinating context in which to try to design a compliance program. Colin doesn't just have some fascinating insights, he's great fun to talk to. So I know that you're going to love this conversation with Colin Pereira on reporting in fragile environments. Colin, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you so much, Christian, for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm a long-time listener of the show, so really pleased to be on the show.
Could you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I run a consultancy that basically specializes in advising media organizations and NGOs that are working in high-risk locations around the world. And I've been doing it for about 20 years, and I started out at the BBC. Then I moved to ITN, which is, for the non-UK listeners, that's the biggest rival to the BBC in the UK. And now I run a consultancy, and I think we are retained by 16 different news organizations to support their teams as they move in and out of complex environments in fragile places around the world.
And of course, those complex environments and fragile places seem to be increasing more and more. So I think we can all recognize that there are challenges out there for news crews trying to get stories. What are the sorts of things that you help people with?
So essentially, when you watch the news or you read a newspaper article, and if it's coming out of a dangerous place, there is often someone like me sitting on the shoulder of a journalist, or sometimes in the field, often with TV crews, it'll be in the field, guiding them and helping them stay safe while they do their job. And for me, I'm not ex-military. The vast majority of the people in this field are military or ex-police or law enforcement in some way. So I don't actually go out and physically protect people. But what I do is I help our clients and I help news organizations and NGOs build the infrastructure by which they prepare their people to go out into the field and prepare their managers to manage deployments in high-risk locations, and most importantly, prepare their managers and their organization to deal with a crisis. So if someone is injured, if someone is damaged in some way, if someone is killed, or if multiple people are injured or killed, or kidnapped even.
And so really you're looking at making the environment as safe as possible, presumably point one, but secondly, preparing the individuals in it from a psychological perspective for what they're letting themselves in for.
So I always tell our clients that we don't control the environment. We have no control of the environment whatsoever. What we control is the caliber of the people that we send into the field and the caliber of the managers who are dealing with them. And so, yes, we're preparing them from a psychological perspective to deal with what they're about to see and encounter, but we are also preparing them in terms of knowledge. So we do a lot of hostile environment training. We do a lot of medical training with them on a regular basis. We do a lot of crisis management training with managers. And we also build their policies and their infrastructure around risk assessment and all of the insurance package, all of that, to make them best prepared to deal with the worst possible scenario.
So presumably there's a combination here of people who have long planned trips to X to go and look at a particular subject. And then you've also got obviously journalists that might get dropped into the field because something that's happened there. So presumably those things are slightly different in terms of how you handle them.
Yes, absolutely. So I work with journalists from an array of different mediums, so print, radio, TV, but also long-form documentaries. And so documentaries are very different from, say, breaking news. And the skill set in making that product is very different, but also the skill set in the way they behaved in the field is very different. So breaking news, as the word breaking news implies, story breaks and they're put on a plane and they're going out there with very little time to prepare or understand what the situation is. And often they will be essentially the first responders. The world knows about what's happening in that location once they start broadcasting out and telling people what's actually happening. That was very much the case before. Now it's a little bit more diluted because of Twitter and social media. So people on the ground are often painting a picture before we even get there. But, they are often the first people on scene. So for natural disasters, for conflict zones, for example, that's very much the case. And so if you just take Ethiopia right now, there's a war happening in the north. There's not a lot of information coming out of it. There's a lot of information on Twitter and social media, but no one knows if it's real. We have crews in Addis. We have crews trying to get to Addis, and they are going to try and go up to the front where the fighting is and tell you, are the rebels, are they actually going to march on Addis, in a matter of days? So those are the kind of discussions we're having. Is it safe to go up to the front? Is it safe to travel up the road? And we have to have real-time intelligence about what's going on. And often we don't have that. So they are the first people who are driving up and saying, looks okay, can we go another 3 kilometers up the road? So those are the kind of discussions we have all the time.
And there's an interesting tension that you've sort of highlighted there between journalistic endeavor, which is they want to get to the story, and what might be safe. How do you think about balancing those two things out? Because I can guess in extremis, you could have a reporter that desperately wants to go or a camera person that desperately wants to go and get the footage of the thing that's happening. And yet from a safety perspective, that makes no sense whatsoever. How does one balance those two things out?
Well, I think it's first being empathetic to the journalist and understanding what they're doing. And I probably should tell you a little bit about my background and how I got into this so that you understand where I'm coming from. So I basically studied terrorism in the 90s, and I focused on Islamic fundamentalism, not because I had any prescience for what was going to happen, but just because I was interested in it. And when I came out of university, I couldn't get a job. I hunted around for a very long time and did an internship with the UN, and then ended up in a terrible job in public relations. And the whole time I was applying to the BBC, applying for jobs from dishwasher up to director general, which is the top job if you don't know that, and going to interviews and completely bombing them because I was totally useless at what I was applying for. But luckily, a job came up on the security team as a researcher analyst. And because of my academic background in terrorism, I managed to get it. I thought I'd do this for 6 months, and then they'll realize I'm genius, put me on the evening news. Obviously, 20 years later, I'm still here in security. So, but the joy of working in the BBC is the BBC is an amazing organization, and they let you do pretty much what you want to do. So I did get to be a journalist. I was a producer for Newsnight and Radio 4. And the reason I bore you with this long story is before I was a journalist, I was part of the security team. And I remember having a conversation with a journalist from The Economist. And he said, this was before I had gone off into production. And he said, it sounds like you don't like journalists very much. And I was saying, it's true, I don't, because they always send me their risk assessment on a Friday night. They're never prepared. They never know what they're doing. They're just sort of bombing out there. And they're a real pain in the butt, quite frankly. And that was me with my compliance hat on. When I became a journalist, in order to deploy into the field, there are so many things you need to do from a production basis that sure enough, I found myself filling out the risk assessment in the car on the way to the airport and speaking to some security guy who was one of my colleagues and saying, it'll be fine, don't worry about it. I know what I'm doing. And he was going, but we need to do this, this, and this. And I was like, no, don't worry. I've thought of all of that. I just don't have time to tell you about it. And once I was a journalist, I realized the pressure they were under and what their business goals were. And it really transformed the way I approach safety and security and compliance. And now I build a model around them in order to really help them get to their business goal, not hinder them, and not put just an unnecessary form in their way, or work out what's the best opportunity for them to fit in with the compliance model, not that not that we're forcing them to do what we want them to do, because we're sort of this overarching compliance lord sitting in the background saying, you must do this, you must do that. At the end of the day, the safety and security people in the media or NGOs are there to deliver the goal of that organization. And that is to put great news on TV. That is to put great news on print. And if you're not aligned to that goal, you won't do your job very well, basically.
Because I can imagine if you decided to approach it with a sort of petty bureaucrat's mindset, there are a ton of reasons why these are bad. It's a dangerous country, unknown factors. I mean, I could imagine it's not a sort of, as you say, the environment's not controllable. So if you were sort of to be to be minded to be a blocker, it'd be very easy to do that. You wouldn't have a job for very long because people would go, we're going to circumvent this. It doesn't understand the business. And so what you're basically highlighting there is that classic tension between the theoretical things you would do, right, if safety and security were the only consideration, balancing that with what are we here to do in the reality of the day job, which is if we don't go anywhere to report stuff, right, we don't have an audience, and therefore we no longer have a business to be able to continue. So it's that classic tension between those two things.
Absolutely. And the thing is, journalism is a bit like the military, or probably medicine or something. It's a self-selecting field. People want to be journalists. They want to go out into the field. But at the same time, they're not stupid. They're not going to take risks unnecessarily. They all want to come home. So, and, one of the things that's really helped me is understanding human nature and how the brain works when it comes to risks. So a lot of compliance models are very, very condescending to the operator. And it's like, we're trying to stop you doing a bad thing. And, the journalist knows that. They know what the bad thing is. They don't want to die. They don't want to be injured. They're also trying to stop that thing, but they just don't enjoy engaging with the bureaucratic process. And, if you look at how the mind works, every 3 seconds we scan for risk, right? Because as a species, we wouldn't be around if we didn't do that, because some saber-toothed tiger would have come out of the bush, eaten our ancestor, and evolution would take place and we wouldn't be here. So the brain is evolved to analyze risk, assess it, and decide what's important, and basically keep people safe. So where the brain is not so good is it takes shortcuts. It has heuristics, right? Because if it was just paranoid all the time and said, that thing's dangerous, I'm not going there, there might be a saber-toothed tiger hiding behind that tree, you would never leave your cave to go hunting, and you would starve to death. Again, evolution wouldn't happen. So the brain has come up with heuristics to say, well, the last 100 times it's been safe, so on the 101st time, it will probably be safe again. You go out, and sure enough, there's a saber-toothed tiger waiting behind the tree on the 101st time, and you have to cope and deal with that. If you don't cope and deal with it, you're dead. If you do cope and deal with it, you'll probably have post-traumatic stress for a little bit, but then your brain will adapt, it will learn from that experience, and it will start up again. My job is to train journalists how to make the best decisions when they're faced by those saber-toothed tigers. It's not to say that you're not going to take any risks. They will take risks. We can't put them in a cotton wool blanket when they're out there, but they need to be the best prepared selves to be ready to face that saber-toothed tiger so that they can run away, survive, and come back again the next day to keep reporting, essentially. Does that make sense? Have I waffled on a little?
No, that makes perfect sense. And I was just wondering, how do you think about, and I'll sort of use the Donald Rumsfeld language, unknown unknowns. So, if you're going into a war zone, there are going to be predictable things, right? Which is there may be some bullets flying around and some slightly aggressive people that you have to contend with, and maybe people that don't want you there reporting. So there's a ton of things that are to an extent predictable, and then there's a ton of things that aren't. How do you think about managing that totality? Because I could imagine, it would be easy to sort of point out to someone, and you sort of see these when you get celebrities doing slightly dangerous things on TV. Maybe they get sent on a training course as to how to handle themselves. And so, don't think that a car is going to protect you from flying bullets, for example. There's a classic things that we see in the movies that might not be true in reality. So you can imagine those, but how do you think about the uncertain things that you might not be able to predict? How does one prepare for those?
Yeah, so, I mean, as you say, there's the foreseeable risk, which we will detail, but there's also the sort of, I'm not going to call them black swans, because I think there's a tendency to focus on black swans, and it gives you an excuse afterwards to say, oh, well, it was a black swan. We couldn't possibly have predicted that.
Nobody could have predicted that. I keep hearing that from people. It's sort of, you say nonsense.
Yeah, so there are blind spots. And so my job from a sort of intelligence analyst perspective is to try and shine a spotlight on those blind spots and say, we don't know this. So because we don't know this, we'll continue our action, but we need to be aware that we don't know this particular factor and adapt to that if it goes this way or that way, right? So we do scenario planning, basically. The problem with that is there's the hindsight bias. When something goes wrong, everyone goes, oh, well, of course you should have predicted that. Because it's really easy to predict it after the event rather than before. So, and again, this comes into the whole preparation of a news organization. So, news organizations do lose people. That's the reality. We do have bad experiences. When we build this infrastructure, we prepare them for that eventuality, and we say, this will happen, but how are you going to react to it? And how are you going to learn from that? And most importantly, how are you going to treat the families of the people who are damaged or injured or have long-term disability or unfortunately kidnapped or killed, right? What are you going to do with all of that? So it's not just blindly going into a situation saying we'll be fine. It's saying, bad things happen. We've got to be prepared for them, and we've got to react to our best possible selves.
And how do we square that thinking with I guess what must be a driver is insurance policies? And if you like, the codifiable versus the uncodifiable, because insurers don't like insuring for sort of things that they can't quantify. So how do you deal with pressures like insurance, I don't know, maybe regulators or other bodies that might not have as pragmatic a view as you do?
Yeah, it's interesting. So when I was young, when I first joined the industry, this hostile environment course was a new thing. And basically everyone said it's because the insurers have insisted on this. And I just took that as per verbatim. When I went higher up the chain and I was involved in buying the insurance, I very proudly went off to this broker and underwriter and showed him our whole model and said, look how amazing we are. And said, we don't care about that. We only care about your claims history. And I was saying, what? But, I've been told that we're doing all of these things for you guys. And
so you're going there with the model exam answer, right? Because you're giving them what you think they want to see.
Yeah. And they basically would have given us insurance no matter what, because it was a very soft market and they were prepared to underwrite risk. Now, as the pandemic becomes endemic, they're asking a lot more questions. But that's pretty much the first time in my career that insurance brokers and underwriters have started asking questions about things. So I think there is this myth that in a lot of people who do high risk things, that the insurance people are there and they won't insure if you don't do certain things. And to a certain degree, they won't. But our news organizations often self-insure. If they won't get the insurance, it's not like they're going to say, well, we're going to miss out on that story because we don't have insurance. The whoever pays the bills for that news organization at the end of the year doesn't care why we haven't got that story. They want awards. They want groundbreaking news. They want to see justification for their investment in us. And the insurance is not an excuse. So we really do this for ourselves. And we do this for the fraternity of journalists to say that we are looking after each other. We're not doing it for outside people.
And so to a certain extent, you are, if you like to take that self-insurance model, you're part of the reason that so if I can't get this thing insured or it's too expensive or whatever, the reason I have Colin on board is to help mitigate that risk. So interestingly, I would have framed it as sort of, we have to have you because the insurer requires it. You're basically saying intrinsically, these organizations recognize that there are going to be some things that are uninsurable. So you're an absolutely necessary part of it.
Yes and no. So prior to 2021, I would have said yes, absolutely. In 2021, I've had more conversations with insurance underwriters and brokers than I've ever had in my career because they're nervous about the risk. So previously, this wasn't such a big issue because they just insured what we did. Now they're kind of saying, well, we won't insure you when you go to Afghanistan. So I do have to go and show them the model and reassure them that we are managing our risks well. And that does lead to our clients getting insurance, but it is at a higher premium than we were paying last year or at any point in my career. But they would not insure our clients if we weren't there. But prior to 2020, I think insurance was this kind of myth that was used against, insurance was the bad guy. You've got to go do this thing. You've got to do this piece of compliance because insurance says so. That's a really easy excuse to blame insurance. It's not because, as an organization, we feel really uncomfortable sending you out into the field without training because we don't think you're able to handle it. Managers don't want to have those conversations with their journalists, so they blame someone else. Security departments don't want to have those conversations with their managers, so they blame someone else. The reality is we do this because we have a moral responsibility to keep all our people safe all the time and to the best of our ability. And they need to be informed what the risks are. They need to be prepared properly, and they need to be in the best place to make the best decisions when they're in facing adversity.
And so, in very simple terms, it's an intrinsically motivated as opposed to extrinsically motivated.
Yes.
It's now recognised as being a necessary thing. So even if the insurer said we don't care, like let's flip the scenario the other way around, right? You would still absolutely be there. Because I guess the reputational risk of not getting this right, both in terms of journalists might not want to work for you, but also the public might get uncomfortable if it thought journalists were put in all sorts of danger. So for all of those reasons, it makes sense to have people with your skills involved in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we just don't want to lose people. We don't, a lot. So I work mostly with foreign news. Since the pandemic, my remit has expanded massively to cover domestic news as well. We understand the realities of going to these places. A large number of my colleagues have had very bad experiences. They suffered trauma, mental trauma, their injuries. We've had fatalities. We know what this means. So we don't do this flippantly. And now, previously, it was kind of a bit of is a very macho, bravo kind of industry. Increasingly, it's become much more mature, and people, understand that their organization needs to look after them, and they understand that they have to be responsible for their colleagues.
I'm fascinated by how you sort of start to gather data. I mean, you talked a little bit about social media and saying that's giving you insights before you get there that wouldn't have been there before, and yet it's obviously of questionable veracity in some cases. How are you gathering data around the risks that you and your clients are facing?
Yeah, so we, as a consultancy, we've spent the last 20 years building up networks of people to verify what was going on. And, if you go back to, we do this every day, but I'll just give you the example of during the Arab Spring, when sort of Twitter was born almost, or at least I was made aware of Twitter. And I can tell you exactly what, I was working for the BBC, there was Tahrir Square, there were millions of people on Tahrir Square, and I had a conversation with Lise Doucette, the world news correspondent for the BBC, and she said, there's this amazing thing called Twitter. Colin, are you on it? And I said, yeah, I've kind of heard of it. And I was very excited because
of course, I'm fully aware of it. All over that, Lise. Yeah, all over it.
And I've just been given a new iPhone by the BBC, so I downloaded Twitter, and I was saying, all these people are just giving us information. It's fantastic. And then very quickly realized that it was being manipulated. The government was providing false information on Twitter. And I actually had to, I phoned up a lot of journalists from different networks. I phoned up people I knew in Egypt, and I was saying, what do you think about the situation? And one journalist said, you've got to speak to this guy. He speaks perfect English. He's on the square every day, and he knows where all the exit locations are and how to get off. So why don't you speak to him? So I said, okay, who is he? And he said, well, he sells orange juice on the square. I said, what? He said, yeah. So he's the orange juice salesman. And, he's a graduate of Cairo University. He can't get a job, and he's squeezing oranges and selling orange juice to, the protesters. But he doesn't want to take any risks with his life. So he's worked out his exit strategy. So I actually phoned up the orange juice salesman and got a lot of great intelligence from him. And so, sometimes I'm speaking to government officials, members of intelligence agencies. Sometimes I'm speaking to the man who sells orange juice on the square.
That is amazing! Wow. And so you prepare people as best you can, and then you and your team are out in the field. That must be quite a stressful existence when you're out in the field, because you have, so the reporter has their, the camera people, they all have their job to do. And yours is kind of to keep an eye on stuff loosely defined. I mean, that must be cognitively quite stressful. And I can imagine in some environments, it's a 24/7 thing, because things obviously could happen while you're asleep. How do you cope with the stresses that poses? Or is it just something you get used to and have processes for managing?
I should just say, so I don't do the sort of close protection work that a lot of my colleagues do. So I don't do this as much, but I have done it a bit in the past. But essentially, a bit exactly what like firefighters and soldiers will tell you. There are long periods of boredom where we do nothing and we're hanging around waiting for something to happen.
Right. I think there's this vision of sort of, you've got bullets flying at you every second of the day, but you're right.
It's like for maybe about 2 or 3 minutes in your career, that's the kind of situation. But most of the time, you're just hanging around, meeting people and chatting to people and waiting for something to break. So there are periods of immense stress. And, what is very stressful is the deadlines that we're under. So we have to produce the news. It has to go out at a certain time. If you are so basically our day is decided by minutes and seconds. And that's when the editor says to us, I need 7 minutes from you. And if that's TV, you've got to go off and gather 7 minutes, which means you're like filming about, 50 minutes. But 50 minutes is a lot to actually film. If you're in a newspaper, they say this is how many words I need from you. So you have to go find those words. And you've got to deliver them on time, because the world is watching. If you don't deliver those 7 minutes or 3 minutes or whatever it is, depending on your news show, you have dead air. And that's not acceptable. So you won't have a job for very long. So basically, our journalists are under immense editorial pressure. Safety-wise, they are sometimes under enormous safety pressure, depending on the story. But again, this comes down to the fabric of the organization. So when we know they're under this kind of safety pressure, that has priority over editorial. So we say, look, they're going to be under huge, huge pressure here. Let's cut them some slack with what they deliver. Don't ask them for War and Peace tonight. Just take what they give you and be happy with it. And the worst thing is when your editor says, yeah, that was all really good, but I'm watching another channel and that thing is better than what you've sent me. This other correspondent has got something better. And so it's a very, very competitive game. And a lot of the pressure is pressure we put on ourselves.
And how do you learn from things that don't go according to plan? Because I can imagine you would want, clearly the obvious thing is, right, if we've experienced something that was unexpected,
whether that's a genuine black swan or something that just sort of went slightly, you would want to sort of update your collective knowledge to make sure that was. How do you do that?
So when an incident happens, there is often a very knee-jerk reaction by a news organization or any organization, and they stand up and say, this should never happen again. We'll never let this happen again. But when they drill down to what's actually happened, they often apply hindsight bias, and they said, well, we should have known this. We should have known that this was going to happen in this way. And you can't possibly do that. So what we try and do is we try and approach it with an open eye and say, where was the decision-making failure? Where could we have seen that this incident was about to occur? And how can we what can we do in our decision-making process to stop that? Now, that has immense implications for the operation. And I have seen this go badly wrong in organizations, right? So often what they'll do is introduce more bureaucracy, and they'll introduce more people into the process of saying, should this team be going out there? And that then puts that team at a disadvantage, because instead of deploying very quickly to a story, they're deploying behind the curve because there's been so much discussion about should they be going, should they not, let's assess this risk, let's have a committee, it's decision by committee then. And I'll tell you a story that will put this in total perspective. So I know a news organization, they had a fatality. They reacted by increasing their risk assessment bureaucracy levels, and it had to be signed off by the very senior people in the organization, along with a number of managers. This created a time lag for the operation. And several years after this fatality, the end result of this, or not the end result because this kept going on, is I was on the Turkey-Syria border, and I bumped into a television crew who I knew very well from a rival organization. And I said to them, how's it all going? And they said, oh, it's great to see you. We hadn't seen each other in a long time. So we hugged, kissed, and we said, let's go have dinner. And we were having dinner. And one of them suddenly sort of looked at me suspiciously, and he said, you know our bosses? And I was like, yeah, of course I know your bosses. I know them really well. And he said, you can't tell them we're having dinner here. You can't tell them we're here in Turkey. Right? And we're right on the Syrian border. And I said, okay, why? I said, because they think we're in Syria. I said, what? What are you talking about? And he said, well, the thing is this, we were in Syria, and we went and we filmed everything that we needed to film, but we're missing a couple of segments, but we didn't want to spend the night there because it was dangerous. So we came back to Turkey. But if we tell the bosses this, we have to do a new risk assessment, and we have to go through the whole approval process. So we've just not told them that we're back in Turkey. They think we're in Syria, and tomorrow we'll go back. So just don't tell them that you've seen us here. I said, but they're probably quite worried, right? And what about your tracker? Because we have these trackers that we keep, where we keep an eye on people. And they said, oh, we left it. We left it in the hotel in Syria. And so, basically, these incredible journalists who are excellent journalists and excellent management have got caught into this loop of a bureaucratic loop where they have to do a risk assessment. The team is actually acting sensibly because they've assessed the risk and they've moved back, but they don't want to tell their bosses because then it has this compliance implication. So they are they're willfully lying to their bosses about what they're doing, even though it's safer than their action if they had spent the night.
This is insane, right?
All to avoid compliance. And so going back to your original question, and this all stems down to the fact that a few years before, this organization had an incident. They reacted, knee-jerk reaction, increased compliance, increased the risk assessment process, increased the approval process, and the end result is your journalists are lying to you. And that's no way to run a business, quite frankly.
Right. I mean, it's deeply ironic, right? Given the objective of journalism is to seek out the truth. Right, it's sort of somewhat ironic that you're in terms of, but I think that's I was struck by your comments earlier around recognizing the realities that's there, right? So journalists are going to want to go out there. So you need to build processes around what they are trying to do, as opposed to get them. So you're working with what they're trying to do, as opposed to getting them to try and work with what you're doing.
Yeah.
And that's a classic dynamic. Whatever industry you're in, that's a sort of classic compliance, legal, insurance, whatever audit type dynamic. And then it's fascinating that you talk there about it, because I wouldn't. So I understand the knee-jerk reaction thing, because it's sort of, well, we better do something, and we better be seen to be doing something. And often it's that second piece that's actually more significant. To have a good, well, probably pun intended, good story to tell if something else goes wrong. Right? At least we've dealt with the issue. But it's fascinating, because I would have thought that the pragmatism that you reflected earlier would have carried through, and yet you're saying there is, even in a world where pragmatism is clearly required, where there is a degree of unpredictability, that bureaucratic tendency kicks in.
It's the unintended consequence of this bureaucracy, and it's facing the. So I'll give you another story that kind of encapsulates this.
You had me in the orange juice cellar, so this is all like amazing stuff on top.
So again, I keep going back to my BBC days, because I can talk a lot about them. I can't talk about other clients so much. But so I was on an embed in Afghanistan, and we were making a piece about the counterinsurgency. This is back in 2009, and we were going out on an IED clearance run. So that's an improvised explosive clearance run. So the Taliban would mine the roads. And the Americans brought in these special vehicles called mine-resistant ambush protected vehicles, MRAPs, that are sort of like trucks on steroids, armor everywhere. They're amazing to look at, huge, huge beasts. And they will drive down the road in a convoy of these vehicles. And in the center of this convoy is a vehicle called the Buffalo. And it's absolutely massive, and it's got sort of mechanical arms, and it will pick up, and it's got metal bins that it will put an IED in, and they'll explode. Amazing feat of engineering. And we had a rule in the BBC and across the media, which is you don't ride in the first vehicle and the last vehicle of a convoy, because if it's going to be ambushed, the ambushers will generally take out those two vehicles first, and so that the convoy is trapped in the middle, and they can then take their time in shooting up the convoy. It's called a kill zone, basically. So I got out to this convoy. Bear in mind, I'm a producer, but I'm also part of the security team, right? So I know this rule inside out. And we get out there, and we're on the base, and my correspondent and the cameraman get told they can go in the Buffalo, but there's no space for me. So I said to the commander, where do I go in the convoy? So, well, there's only space in the last vehicle. I was going, oh, well, I'm not allowed to do that. Sort of the rules. Can
I have a business class seat, please, as opposed to the back of the plane?
But, can't I sit anywhere else in the convoy? So there's nowhere else, and everyone else is a fighting soldier. You're just dead weight to us. So you go in the back. And I looked at my correspondent, and I could not say to her, I'm not going on this run. You guys take this enormous risk and go off on this IED run.
I'll just hang here and drink tea. Well,
right. So I said, okay, because she wouldn't have done it, right? And I couldn't, so I said, well, I'll jump in the back. And we went off on this convoy. And the whole way I was like, please don't let anything happen. Not because I was worried about dying, because I was worried about having to tell my boss or say that I was in the last vehicle of this convoy. And that was my biggest fear. And anyway, we toured around for hours and hours and hours. They saw all the action. I couldn't see anything in the back of this vehicle. So I was basically just in a sort of moving prison cell for about 6 hours, hearing the occasional explosion, and taking what was quite a significant risk, I guess, but nothing happened. So, it's by the by. But when I got out, and I'm telling this story now, but I didn't tell anyone at the BBC for years and years and years, because it was against the rules. But I had to do it because I needed to get that story. That was a crucial segment to our piece. If we didn't do it, we had a real problem to our story. And I just took a calculated risk at the time. And, the risk was, these guys do this every day. There's always going to be a last vehicle. And yes, there is a statistically higher chance. But, I asked a lot of questions. I said, what do you think the risks are? And the commander said, there is risk, but you'll be fine. So I said, okay, good. And as the person in the field, I should be empowered to make that decision. People from 2,000 miles away can't make that decision, or 5,000 miles away. It's got to be me, because I'm the one taking the risk.
But I mean, that's a great example of what are you supposed to do? Because you're sort of between it's a compliance requirement that puts you between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah. Because
you either comply with the rules and you effectively, from a journalistic perspective, screw up the mission, ruin your reputation with the military because they'll, so there's a whole load of reasons why sticking to the rules is not a good outcome for the journalistic mission that's on. On the other hand, you can sort of understand why they've come up with those rules in the first place. And you're then required to sit in the field and kind of make that override. And there's no way that the rules have sort of contemplated the moral dilemma that is placed into your head, which is, how do I get out of this? Because there isn't a path to solving the problem that is compliant. You will cause other unintended consequences if you stick to the rules. If you break the rules, you'll get the outcome that's desired. So that's a really interesting example of a sort of codified world that doesn't work in practice. And you've got no way out. You're trapped in this thing where whatever you do is not going to be right.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right when you look at it on sort of paper and in the cold light of day. The difference is, what we focus on building in our organizations is trust and empathy between the different echelons. So if my bosses trust me to make that decision, they'll back me. And likewise, if I trust that they're putting a rule in place, not to stop me, but because it's actually there to protect me and not just make their lives easier, then I will follow that rule. So, there's got to be a bit of give and take. And news organizations are very, very good at this, I have to say. But the compliance piece often doesn't reflect this and just leaves this bit out and doesn't talk about trust and empathy. It says, here's the rules, you follow the rules, that's that. But people are people. And so your boss who's known you for 20 years, because that guy's going to make a good decision, I'll let him go with it. And, that's what we have to codify, is that intangible emotion between us. And so that's what we really specialize in bringing to our client base and, focusing on our clients. And that's what we do a lot of training about. And knowing, so, if I was a young, inexperienced person, which I was, quite frankly, but I didn't have a history of good judgment, and I phoned up my boss and I said, I'm in this position, what should I do? My boss could say, well, you haven't shown a good history of decision making. We're not going to let you do this. But then I shouldn't be in that position. I shouldn't be in the field to make that. So a lot of our work is spent like I go back to that comment. We don't control the environment. We control the caliber of the people we send out there. So, and that's a lot of training them, experience, looking at their common sense, but it's also assessing them.
And so implicit in assessing them is a sort of they're ready for it or they're not type judgment, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah.
It sounds like there are situations where you would say to the client, look, actually, this isn't someone that's necessarily ready for that sort of thing at the moment. I guess there's particularly if it's in a dangerous environment and you're sending people with them, you sort of sit there and say, we don't want to take somebody who might be a liability. We need to be able to rely on their judgment and common sense to work with us, because otherwise they're just adding additional risk.
Yeah,
because their behavior is unpredictable and unreliable.
Yeah, absolutely. And and what the business has to do is its compliance model needs to reflect that and capture these sort of intangibles between people. So one of the things I've realized is, so I've been building a piece of software. It's a piece of risk assessment software, because most of our clients, they use it's amazing to me, actually. Most people, when they do risk assessments, they're all done in Word, right?
I was going to say it's either that or Excel. I've seen one done in PowerPoint once, which I thought was a crazy thing. But you're right; it all sits in the Microsoft Office. Wasn't designed as a risk management tool.
Yeah,
and yet.
So what happens when people are writing their risk assessment? I've done this myself, right? So they're writing the risk assessment. Why are they writing it? They're writing it to impress the boss, to get approval, right?
Because they have to.
Yeah, they have to, basically. because they know the risk. They've already done the risk assessment in the brain, right? And
right, because if they thought it was really bad, they wouldn't be going. So they've already decided. Well, so implicitly, you're going to already go do this, right?
Yeah, but I mean, it does help to write things down and say, how do we mitigate this and think it through, without a doubt, right? So it is a useful process. But Word and Excel have a massive problem, which is people will go and cut and paste from a different format into Word and Excel, okay? And then there's a formatting problem, because it won't fit in the tables that you've put into Word, or it doesn't look good in Excel.
I was just envisaging someone going, I will take the risk assessment for France and I'll search and replace and put Afghanistan in.
Well, sometimes they do that when they're in Iraq. That's not far from the truth sometimes. But what happens is, so we've spoken to a lot of people about this, and we say, so what do you do when you're writing the risk assessment? What's the majority of your time spent? And I say, it's messing around with the tables. Like, what? It's like, yeah, basically, we're constantly rejigging the tables, rejigging the formatting, trying to make it look pretty. Because if it goes to the bosses and it's all over the place and it's in different fonts, obviously they're going to take one look at that and go, that's a dog's dinner. We're not signing that off. They won't even read what's in it. And so most people spend a lot of time making the form look pretty. Now, bear in mind, they don't have a lot of time, right? So they spend a lot of time in this allocated time making the form look pretty, which means they don't spend a lot of time assessing the risk, which is the purpose of the process, right? So we've digitized the risk assessment so you don't have to worry about this kind of formatting thing. And immediately the quality of the risk assessments has got better. We've then done another thing in our piece of software, which... I mean,
like anybody that's not in the sort of risk compliance industry would be going, that sounds insane. And you're like, no, but this really does happen. So what you've just described there sounds ridiculously simple, but it's groundbreaking, right? Let's remove the stress of that and get people to focus on the content rather than... it's literally substance over form.
Yeah, let's make the form easy to fill out, basically, is what we've done, right? And then we've done another thing, which is, so we have standard operating procedures for a lot of things, right? And it's a standard block saying this is the best practice guidance for reporting on a terrorist attack. And it's really good guidance. It's like, don't rush down to the scene of an incident when the bomb's first gone off, because there's a good chance there's going to be a secondary bomb, right? And we train this into people and we write it down in the guidance and we make it available to them when there's a terrorist attack, right? Or we specialize in that. And we drum this message home. And in Afghanistan a few years back, Afghan journalists are not trained in this, and there was a bomb. They ran down to the scene of the incident, and I think 9 of them were killed in a secondary follow-up explosion. So it's a real risk, right? So in a number of the things that we do, we have this sort of best practice guidance, standard operating procedures. But they're housed in a manual on the internet, right? That no one knows where to find it. So you're going off to report on a terrorist attack or a wildfire or whatever as a journalist, and you're under pressure, you're trying to fill out this form, you're trying to mess up with the formatting, and then you're trying to go off to the internet to find this manual, which when you're outside the building, you can't access the internet anyway. It's a nightmare. And so they literally will write, it'll be fine. Right? I can't tell you how many risk assessments I've seen that say that. So we have again taken this really groundbreaking, revolutionary idea that they select the risk, terrorism, and the best practice guidance automatically populates into the form so they can read it and say, yeah, we know what it's just an aid memoir, basically, right, before they rush out there. Now, they might not read it, but we've spoken to a lot of them and they actually are doing it. And maybe not before a terrorist attack, for example, but one of the high-risk activities we have is hiring a boat, for example. At the moment, because of the migrants crossing the channel, we have newsrooms every day hiring boats and going out into the English Channel, which is a major shipping lane, right? To film these rubber dinghies crossing the English Channel. They have all these hurdles or all these things they need to do before they hire the boat. They need to check the insurance of the boat. They need to check the license of the skipper. They need to check the seaworthiness of the boat. All of these things are in this manual. Now, do you know what a skipper's license looks like? So you say all of these things to them and they're like, yeah, okay, we'll go do that. But it's difficult for them to actually do all of this stuff because they don't know what a skipper's license looks like. So in our software, we have examples of this. So, you need to check the skipper's license. This is what it looks like. So they do the risk assessment, go, all right, okay, let's go ask this man some questions before we get on his boat, or woman, I should say, this captain, before we jump on the boat. So again, it's just taking a process that, all this knowledge that's really useful to them and making it available to them in this piece of software and making it quick and fast for them to do, right? And they love it because, they love it primarily because they don't have to mess around with formatting. And it's amazing to me. It's, it's a really simple solution, but it's something that really helps them. And the other thing that we've built into this software, which they absolutely love, right, is we ask their opinion about risk. So my journalists are experts at their fields, right? They stand on the news every night and tell other people what to think about the world, essentially, right? So people going off to Afghanistan, they know Afghanistan really well generally, or they know, risky environments, or we're training them to experience that. And one of the things that we've been terrible at, and I think most risk managers is asking the user what their opinion is about the risk. And it's difficult, right? Because they don't have time. They come back off a deployment and they're like, hey, I don't have time to do this long drawn out debrief. So we've just built it into this piece of software that after they go off, after they return from a trip, they get an email saying, how was your trip? Was there anything that occurred that you think you should flag up to colleagues in the future about safety? And that line is really crucial because it's not tell your risk department about safety, it's tell your colleagues about safety. And sure enough, they put feedback in and they say, this thing happened to me and I didn't like it. So tell the others not to, go to that bar or whatever it is. And I'll give you an example. Like one of our clients, they cover the political conferences. And the engineers go up there a few weeks beforehand and they set up all the, the sets and everything, and they're laying cable and all of those kind of things before the actual crews arrive to do the filming. And an engineer put into the feedback, don't go to this Indian restaurant, you'll get a dodgy tummy. Right? Because obviously that's what happened to him.
Right.
And it was the closest Indian restaurant to the convention center, and they all avoided it. But that is a massive problem because if our crews arrive, the first thing they do on the evening they get there, they all have a big dinner. They probably go to the local curry house because, it's
convenient, right?
Everything is convenient. They all get food poisoning, and we have to bring up a whole new crew the next day because all our original crew are lying in bed with food poisoning. So that simple bit of feedback, saves us a lot of cost and money and effort, or could do, right?
I mean, that's interesting, right? Because you've created TripAdvisor, basically, but it's sort of Risk Advisor that is crowdsourcing stuff from the people that have been through this. So on the one hand, a really simple idea, as you say. On the other hand, like super smooth. There is a reason we read TripAdvisor reviews, right? Apart from the fact that we're ranty people who clearly, expect 5-star when they pay for 1-star. But in this case, right, it's relevant information. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, so it has a business continuity impact. The people who are filling out the feedback feel valued because they're saying, actually, we're sharing this with colleagues. It goes out into the system. And actually, you call it Risk Advisor, we call it RiskPal, actually, our software. And it, one of our biggest problems is third-party suppliers. So we've got clients who use drivers and fixers. Those are local producers, local journalists who know the story better than we do when we arrive. And they facilitate everything. And most of the time, 99% of these times, these individuals are fantastic. But occasionally we'll have a drunk driver that turns up. Right, a drunk chauffeur or something. And what used to happen is our client would phone us up and say, Colin, I arrived in Joburg, the driver turned up, smelled alcohol in his breath, he was a bit unprofessional, didn't like him. And I'll say, that's shocking, we'll never use this person again. I have no way of enforcing that. Right. And 3 months later, I'm on holiday and I don't speak to every team that goes to South Africa. Right. And there's no depository for me to put this information that they all check before they go. So, or there wasn't. And so they go off to 3 months later, 6 months later, I've got another crew that hires this driver because, someone recommended him, that's how our original person found him. And they have a car accident. And now I have legal liability because they've actually told me this driver is not fit for purpose, but I haven't put anything in place to stop us using them. And so our system just captures all of that. And it's amazing. So, going back to our conversation about compliance, your compliance system needs to fit the business and help them, because the reason why we put these suppliers in there is because they spend a lot of time finding suppliers. And now they have a vetted list of suppliers with a 5-star, 3-star rating, a bit of feedback from people they trust, TripAdvisor essentially, and they like it.
You've made the point. One is it's practically useful, right? It genuinely helps. But two, I think the psychology of we actually care about what you think. Because obviously in this context, right, they know that, as you say, they know they're taking risks, they're going into and sort of, I would quite like to be asked what I thought, right, feels like a good thing. And it's not just a sort of frivolous, have you enjoyed your stay in this hotel type question. It's something that is genuinely useful. If it's bothered them, I think that's a really powerful gathering, you're gathering useful data, but the psychological impact on the people means that actually they're much more likely to listen to you and trust you because there's a feedback loop there for them and it's not something that's being imposed on them.
Absolutely. Because, I can't tell you how many travelers I've spoken to. So the normal way of doing a travel risk assessment in corporates is to someone generates a risk assessment and it's a country brief. So say you've got a banker going to Nigeria, right? The banker gets on the plane, he'll get an email from the travel management company, and it will have an attachment from a security company that says, this is Nigeria. And it'll say, there's a high risk of crime, high risk of terrorism, blah, 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 blah. And they go, thanks for that. And they won't even open it most of the time. But the company says, well, we've told you. So if anything bad happens to you, it's on your head. Right. And basically, they're just passing the sort of risk, it's risk transference. We've told you, now it's all on you. And the banker knows that. He knows he's got this risk transfer and he's really upset about it. And it just creates distrust between the organization. So, the security compliance function is trying to protect the business. It's not trying to protect the individual. And by actually asking people to do things, to give feedback, asking them for their opinion, because that banker might have been to Nigeria 50 times, right? He might be sitting on a wealth of information about Nigeria that other more junior bankers might benefit from, right? But no one's ever bothered to ask it.
And I love that actually on the liability transfer point. That's really interesting because you're leveling up as well. So there's not just the sort of psychological, they actually care what I think. They're asking a sensible question. Is actually you've then got an opportunity to kind of throw it back over the fence and go, right, actually, I'm reporting something and I expect you to do something about it. And if subsequently people go on trips and they haven't been made aware of that because you've chosen not to do anything with that report, it's on you. It's not on me. And I love the psychological reversal there. It's a real opportunity for the loop because normally, as you say, it is one way. It's organization on to employee. Well, we did tell you, which is deeply irritating. But actually, this is an opportunity to lob something back and go, here you go. Well, I've given you something. You need to do something with that. That is quite positive as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing we like about it is, quite bluntly speaking, so, security and safety are kind of, they're not very, very diverse, right? It's white male dominated. Your audience won't know this, but I'm an Indian male, born in Africa from Portugal, but I'm still, sort of very male. And
I can confirm that, seeing, you're very, very male. Absolutely.
Yeah, right. And, until recently, there haven't been a lot of women in the industry. There are not a lot of ethnic minorities. And there are huge safety issues that just go unnoticed. So I'll give you an example, and it's an extreme example. I'm sure this happens to most corporate travelers or, in most safety issues. So we have this rule again about staying hydrated, So on all our training, you're going off into the field, stay hydrated, right? Because we're worried about in hot environments when we're off in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, all of these places, Spain, Portugal, it's hot. People, they're busy with work, they don't drink, and they're very vulnerable to heat stroke. But when you're on a road journey, which a lot of journalists are, in a lot of countries, they're not very good toilets for women to use. And a few years back, we had quite an inexperienced traveler, and she was embarrassed to talk about toilet breaks with us. And the crew was mostly men. And so she didn't drink because she didn't want to stop, and go pee behind a bush in this foreign country that she didn't really know. And it was culturally, she couldn't have done that anyway, right? It would have been really insensitive. So she just didn't drink. And then later on in the day, she nearly came down with heat stroke. And they managed to avoid it because they realized what's happening and they filled it with liquid. But then I thought, I've never really thought about this issue before. And I went and talked to a number of women journalists. And I said, what happens when you're on a road journey? And they said, we just don't drink. Because we don't want to have to pee in the field because, if you're in a conservative culture, that just won't go down very well. I said, but what about all this information we give you about hydration? I said, yeah, we just ignore that. I was like, it just never occurred to me.
Right.
Because I'm a bloke.
Why would it have done? Right.
Yeah, I'm a bloke. If I need to pee, I jump out of the car and I go pee behind a tree. It's really easy for me. But now what we've built into our road journeys is when we're going to stop for toilet breaks, right? Because it's easier to stop for a toilet break at a restaurant or a gas station or whatever than it is to carry out a medevac for a heat stroke. It costs us a lot of money and effort and time. So, and that's just a diversity issue, right? We just did not have the knowledge to understand that this is what female journalists have to do when they're on the road. And there are hundreds of little stories like that. So again, this piece of feedback loop, they might not talk about bathroom breaks, but they might not say go for a bathroom break in the piece of software, but they'll say these are good places to stop along the road when you're going along in this journey, right? So it's things like that that's really, really important and encapsulates the entire population of your workforce.
I love that actually, because this plays into the whole data gap piece, right? So we run the world on male data predominantly because we haven't had women doing those roles, and then let's go even further than that and then say it's largely a sort of white based data for historical reasons, and so you're right. As you increase the workforce and bring more diversity in, there are going to be dynamics that will never occur to you, even if you are as think creatively and broadly, because that's not your experience. And so I think that's a wonderful way of thinking about, how we deal with the inclusion piece of diversity and inclusion, because we'll bring and I'm guessing with sort of people that are on camera, that the propensity for news organizations to want to be seen to be doing that and also wanting the benefits of having diversity are going to be clear. So this dynamic that you've described, it's going to face all organizations, but I suspect particularly media companies are going to probably have to be ahead of the curve in many respects and therefore these problems are going to be greater. And I think that's a really good example of something where you can have the best quote unquote the best risk minds on something, but if you haven't got that practical experience, it's not going to occur to you. So I love that idea of crowdsourcing those insights. Yeah. And so as you say, you're not sort of saying, where is our framework? In essence, the question you're asking is, what didn't we tell you about that would have been good to know about? You're asking that question, but framed in a slightly different way, which is you can choose to answer this however you want, right? Just brain dump whatever you think is useful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, although you say media has to be ahead of the curve, we're probably not ahead of the curve in terms of diversity in a lot of areas. I'm pretty sure we're not. And
it's interesting you said that. Actually, I'm basing it on what I'm seeing in front of the camera, but you're of course totally correct that that's a very small percentage of the entire workforce. Yeah.
So behind the camera, the media are known for not being diverse, and they're trying to rectify it, but it's something that is a problem for us. But across all businesses, There's this statistic that's wheeled out. I don't know if it's true or not, but it sounds very compelling. That businesses that are
we like a good story, so tell us.
Exactly. Businesses that are diverse make more money. And it does kind of make sense because, like, if you look at Brexit and Trump and things like that, the media didn't see that coming because we're stuck in our little echo chamber, quite frankly, and we didn't want to get out of it. And when those things happened, it suddenly forced us to confront an uncomfortable reality that, we can't all be Oxbridge educated or go to these nice schools and then start pontificating about what the world is like for other people. And, in established news organizations, they are very elitist to a certain degree.
Wow. I could keep talking to you forever, but I'm very, very conscious of time. So, Colin, before I say thank you to you for what's been a phenomenally fascinating set of insights, tell people how they can get hold of you, because I think even if they're not running media companies that need this, there may be people that need your specialist skills. I'm thinking now of Liam Neeson in Taken. You feel like you've got these special skills that people might need. But I think the second thing is, I think you've got some fascinating insights that are supremely relevant. So even if people weren't hiring you, my suspicion is they might want to hire you to come and talk about some of these topics as well. So how can they find you?
So probably the best way is LinkedIn. Colin Pereira at HP Risk Management on LinkedIn or RiskPal should pop me up straight away.
Fantastic. Well, I will pop a link to that and other relevant things in the show notes. But all that remains for me to do is to say thank you so much for coming onto the show. As I said before, you had me at the orange juice cellar. There are a ton of other things that we've gleaned. It's the sort of episode I'm going to want to listen to again and think about more, because you've raised tremendous amount of issues. So thank you so much, one, for the work that you do, because obviously we wouldn't have journalists out in the field telling us what's going on if we didn't have people like you doing that. But secondly, thank you for being a fabulous guest on the podcast.
Well, thanks, Christian. Thanks for having me. I love the podcast. It's really opened my mind to a lot of things. So yeah, real pleasure. And yeah, if anyone wants to contact me, feel free.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My huge thanks to Colin for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Colin, HP Risk Management, and RiskPal, their online risk assessment platform, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star review for it, please do so. It really does help. To find out more about Human Risk, the work that I do with my clients, the Human Risk newsletter, blog, and video blog, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back with another episode of this show very soon. But in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.